probably most of you seen Tiger 131, which is our tiger in the museum, captured by the British Army in North Africa, 1943.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my painting of a 1 to 35th King Tiger from Hobbyboss. This kit, as you will see here, has a metal barrel I bought separately, but also a Tamiya Zimmerit sheet which I applied. The first step in painting for me was a red oxide primer, which I'm not doing for purposes involving chipping, as in I won't be chipping down to the red oxide layer. This was simply done to mimic standard German painting schemes in which a red oxide primer was applied. Unfortunately, I don't have a dedicated red oxide primer, so I did this over a normal Vallejo black primer. On top of the red, I started with Dunkelgelb DG1, which, as you will see in just a moment, I cover up as this wasn't the right color. I quickly switched to standard Dunkelgelb, because as you will see here, it's a much more neutral tone, where the DG1 was very sort of saturated, oversaturated and pale. The goal here for me was to not complete a matte finish, but more of a cloudy finish where the red oxide sort of peeks through slightly, not leaving large gaps where pure red can be seen, but more of sort of a erratic finish, a more realistic factory finish. I then moved on to a mix of Creme Weiss and Dunkelgelb DG1, which worked as a nice little post shade. Again, as you can see here, I took the nozzle off of the airbrush and moved around the airbrush quite a lot to get that cloudy finish again. You can also see here how nice the tarp looks. I 3D printed myself a box in 1 to 35th scale and covered it in, like I said, a dried lens wipe. The lens wipe has a really good texture and, like I said, it just looks really realistic. And the next step after this was the camouflage. Shocker brown is a really nice deep brown, and it's also a perfect base for later post shading. The one mistake I did make was use a ballpoint pen to trace the camouflage, which I won't ever be doing again because it took several layers of paint to cover the ballpoint marks. But other than that, I was going for a feathered approach, so you'll notice the lack of any masking or blue tack, and this creates the soft edges of a German camouflage rather than some which are very crisp. Off camera, I simply repeated the same for the green, and then before post shading I went back to the base color, which was the Dunkelgelb, and cleaned up all of the overspray. I was having some issues with the airbrush and it was spitting paint quite a lot, so this was a necessary step. As you can see there, the airbrush did overshoot quite a little bit. The issue with this step, the covering of the overspray, was that it left a very visible sort of whitish, yellowish outline on all the camouflages, but I fixed this with the overspray by going over it with a lighter color. So far, I could stop here and start weathering, but I wasn't pleased with how flat and uniform the surface looked. At this point, I also invested in a new camera boom. The angle will get better shortly. I was still figuring out how to use it here. The next step involved adding buff to all of the paints to lighten them up, as well as some flow improver to make sure I get that, like I said, the cloudy finish. I started with a small amount of buff, and yeah, those are the references I used. So I visited the tank museum myself and took some references like the one on the screen there. And this is why I was motivated to paint this tank. If you haven't seen my videos before, I have painted a real reference tank, my Panzer III. So if you'd like to see another similar video to this one, please go check that one out. Here is a really good angle to see the post shading. It creates a really nice finish and it distorts the flat, otherwise very flat and monotone surface in my opinion. I do several layers of post shading because I want to catch the higher details and make them brighter obviously than the details that are more hidden. So which is why here I'm going quite aggressive on the top of the tank. I keep adding buff. And at this point, I don't think I show it, but I did add a drop or two of pure white from Vallejo, just to make it stand out even more against the otherwise flat brown. Next, I go for straight Resadergrün. This is just a standard green, but since I applied olive grün, which was the base green, this worked pretty well as a very good highlight color. And again, applying it in a very cloudy finish. I start from the top and work my way down, since the top would be slightly more faded than the bottom due to the sun and perhaps more exposure to the elements. And this was a very satisfying step. As you can see, it really almost wakes up the tank's surface. I then applied a standard matte coat for no particular reason, just to protect it from some later thinners and perhaps some rougher work with a brush. The first weathering step was a dark wash. I cut this with some enamel thinner and applied it as a global wash. Some call it a global wash, but to me it's more like a filter because it was very thin and I applied it all over the surface of the tank to sort of almost unify the different tones, but also to bring down the saturation of the different post-shaded surfaces. Here I didn't thin the wash enough, and as you can see it's clumping almost, so I do go over it with some thinner and spread it out and wipe off most of the leftover paint. I found it extremely important to dilute the wash extremely heavily when working with Zimmerit, however, because the wash tended to pool in the little bumps and different surfaces in the Zimmerit. Again, this is how it looked just after washing. As you can see, it's still a bit shiny since the enamel wash is still wet. The next step was a pin wash with some black. Since I sculpted the weld lines myself with some Tamiya epoxy putty, this was a really satisfying step. This next step is extremely influenced by Night Shift on YouTube. I apply an oil dot filter using white, a sort of beige and a yellow. I apply these as a dot and scatter this all over the tank, as you can see here. This will then be thinned down with an enamel thinner to create a faded look. On vertical surfaces or sloped surfaces, it can look like rain effects almost. As you can see here, this is how it looked before blending. I didn't expect this to be as much of a challenge, however, because the dots did catch the Zimmerit texture, as you can see here. So this did require quite a bit of patience and time, but the end result was extremely worth it. On flatter surfaces, I used a stippling approach, not for any particular reason, just I found it easier to blend all the different tones together, the white, the beige and the yellow. And this created, again, sort of a mess, which required more enamel thinner to wipe off and make the effect I was looking for. I then applied the German cross. Unfortunately, the tank reference is a 104, but I don't have the decals on hand right now, and I did already spend quite a lot of money on this project, and I didn't want to buy some third market decals, so the German cross was just applied. Now I fill in the Zimmerit chips. The standard oxide paint from AK was extremely realistic but a bit dull, so I added white and some brick red, and this made it much more vibrant. The reason I needed a vibrant paint was firstly because I really wanted to stand out, and secondly because I will be doing a step next which will dim it down quite a bit. I didn't employ many Zimmerit chips. They are few and far between. I think there are just around 5 over this entire surface of the tank, and I did this because I think large amounts of red would overpower the camo I spent a lot of time painting, so this struck a perfect balance in between the two. Again, this is how it looked at this step in the painting. One of the final steps was a washable colour from AK. Again, this paint is essentially just chipping fluid and white paint mixed into one formula. So instead of spraying and waiting for hairspray or chipping fluid to dry, you just paint it all in one go, and it can be wiped off and blended with some water. Coverage isn't extremely important because obviously it will be blended with a stiff brush later, so I just apply it in a haphazard way. The only time I do apply caution is to make sure that the white paint doesn't go over the Zimmerit, because this would be an extreme pain to clean with all the texture and crevices in the Zimmerit. I then go at it with some water and a brush. I'm not trying to chip it in the sense where sometimes you see winter camouflages that are chipped or rust chipping. I'm instead blending it into the red because I'm trying to simulate, obviously, Zimmerit paste. So this is instead being pushed into the corners of the chip and applied in such a way. Obviously a paper towel helps to wipe off the excess paint from the brush, but as you can see on the lower chip there, it does leave a very nice surface, and the white paint does sort of act as a filter or tint on the surface of the red oxide primer, which is why I did create a much more saturated version, because otherwise I believe the standard AK red oxide paint would have been very dim. The last step of this video was me sketching some of the Zimmerit shapes back into the chip. This, obviously, as you can see here, isn't anything surgical on my part. I did just very roughly sketch rectangles into the paint, but from a distance it looks alright. And that's the end result. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.